Hey everybody, I've actually snuck out in the middle of the night to the car to make this video, so depending on how many views it gets I might be in a lot of trouble with my wife. But basically what happened is I woke up in the middle of the night and I just couldn't get back to sleep thinking about lockdowns in Australia and the situation with COVID, and I don't think it's going well. And I saw some coverage from overseas where some people that I follow online were talking about how, seeing the recent news that's happened, how severe the lockdowns have been, and also the shooting of the dogs where, you know, in Australia, some dogs were shot because some people were coming to pick them up, to take care of them, rescue dogs, and they were shot because people were worried that it could spread COVID. And so the people that I was watching were saying that they used to have this fantastic image about Australia, that we're these, kind of happy, free, down to earth kind of people, and they were actually sort of scared. And it's something that I just couldn't stand, so I just felt that I had to say something. There are a couple of things I want to address in this video. Firstly, I do think that lockdowns and restrictions have gone too far. I understand people's fear, and some level of restriction is fair in order to manage the crisis. But I do think things have gone too far, and I will be talking about that. First off, I wanted to just help people outside of Australia understand what's going on, because if you look at media reports, especially I've seen some in the US, people are absolutely baffled as to how and why Australia is locking down so hard over a small number of cases. So we have, a death rate of, 2 or 3 people dying each day from COVID, and in other countries where their COVID death rates have gone up to into the thousands, it just seems totally bizarre that we would have such harsh restrictions for a death rate that is so low. The first thing you need to understand about Australia's response to coronavirus is that we've never had widespread community outbreak in the way that countries like the United States or the UK or other European countries have experienced. So this means that what lockdowns and restrictions are trying to achieve is totally different. In the 2020 outbreaks, our COVID numbers were small enough that lockdowns combined with contact tracing was enough to put out what was essentially a small fire. In Australia, the lockdowns were actually successful in stamping out the virus pretty much altogether. And that was because we never had serious, widespread infections all throughout the community. So it was something that was possible here that was not possible anywhere else. In a lot of ways, we're the victim of that success in Australia, because if you think about that strategy, the problem with using lockdowns to stamp out the virus is it doesn't actually solve anything. In 2020, we locked down, managed to push the virus away, but it didn't disappear from the face of the earth. So now in 2021, when it's come back, Australia actually has low vaccination rates, and we have effectively zero natural immunity in the population. So what's happening is the politicians are absolutely panicking, because we are in a situation where we're not all that much better off than where the United States was in March of 2020. So when you look at how crazy things are getting here, you have to understand that politicians and authorities are looking at Australia, and they're fearful that we're going to experience the rates of death that countries like the United Kingdom and the US have experienced throughout the last year. So it's almost like Pandora's box is opening, and the politicians are desperate to close it before the situation gets totally out of control. Next, I want to talk a little bit about why the Australian population is willing to accept restrictions on this level. So again, in the US, a lot of people are baffled, not just why the restriction's so severe, but why does the population accept it? So firstly, the population accepts it because the lockdowns in 2020 appear to have worked. Now, I just said how there's a huge flaw in that plan, being the lockdowns don't solve anything. But the Australian population, the experience of the Australian population, for the most part, has been watching the rest of the world struggle and deal with coronavirus while we've been pretty happy and free here the whole time. In New South Wales, where I live now, the lockdowns last year, we had a few weeks of lockdowns, and then it opened up and life pretty much went back to normal. And I was looking across the world, and you could see other countries struggling much harder with coronavirus than we were in Australia. So that sort of melded into the brains of Australians that, it seemed like our authorities really knew how to manage it the first time. We had a pretty good experience, and we're afraid of becoming like other countries across the world. The second part of it is understanding sort of the psychology of Australia and of Australians, because if you look at the US, I see a lot of US commentators saying, "Oh, don't you care about your liberty? Don't you care about your freedom?" and all of those kinds of things. The Australian culture is very different. We don't have, in my opinion, we do love freedom, but we don't have this conscious political ideology of freedom. We love it because we love living our lives freely and being able to do what we want. But we don't have this conscious ideology where we, say that we have this right and that right. We sort of just kind of live it. And I do think to some degree we're a little bit naive in that sense. Another part of the psychology that's important is what's called in Australia as the tall poppy syndrome. Now, the tall poppy syndrome is sort of a very famous feature of Australian psychology. It's sort of the Australian sense that nobody is better than anybody else. And what that means is if you're getting a bit of a big head and you think you're the best, Australians will not look on that kindly, and we can very quickly cut someone down. So that sometimes it's a very wonderful part of our character, because we don't sort of tolerate people thinking that they're above other people in sort of general everyday life. But that can be a bad thing, and I think what's happened here is you've seen the tall poppy syndrome kind of leveraged against people who are critical of lockdowns and people who want to complain. And at the very worst, I've seen people going around talking about how, oh, well, if you don't want to get the vaccine, you should die. And some of that is really dark, and I don't like hearing that, and I don't like thinking that that's what people in my country are thinking about other people. So I think part of what's happened is the tall poppy syndrome, which can be a very good feature of Australian psychology. It's sort of morphed into this, well, we're all struggling here together to deal with the virus, and if you don't like it, if you're complaining, if you're protesting, or if you're breaking the rules, then you're the tall poppy and you need to be cut down. And the last thing I want to say about the Australian people's sort of it's apparent willingness to sort of roll over and accept tyranny. I know a lot of people are saying that the willingness to roll over and accept tyranny is that it really is only temporary. Part of the reason I'm making this video is because I think tensions are going to rise once it becomes clear that the government has lost control of the situation, and that lockdowns and restrictions are likely going to extend for much longer than we're being told now. Finally, I want to get on to the current levels of restrictions and why I don't think things are going to pan out quite so neatly the way the government wants it to. I don't think that current restrictions are actually containing coronavirus. I think that when this outbreak happened, government went down really hard with the restrictions because they wanted to stop it from getting out of control. I think it really is now out of control, and I don't think we can any longer avoid a situation where there's going to be widespread community infection of COVID. Now, you've already seen government start to pivot a little bit, and they're using this new phrase, living with COVID, so it's a good thing that they appear to accept that we can't have a zero COVID strategy forever. The only problem is the government appears to have such fear of COVID and such a desire to control the population that I think they're going to have excessive restrictions for much longer than is really necessary and can really be tolerated by the public, it's nowhere near the world-ending pandemic that we all feared it was going to be when it started in early 2020. And it just seems as if the level of restriction placed by the government hasn't sort of caught up with that. The government is saying if we reach the vaccination target, then we're going to release restrictions. But I'm looking over at countries like Israel and the United States, where they have much higher levels of vaccination than we do, and they're still freaked out by COVID.